The dust was a living thing. It coated the tongue, settled in the creases of Gideon Flint's eyes, and spun in lazy golden funnels across the sun-scoured expanse of his ranch. It was the same dust that had been here when his grandfather broke the land, the same dust that had swallowed his father's sweat, the same dust that now seemed to be burying him alive. From the worn vinyl of his wheelchair, the world was a panorama of failure, painted in shades of ochre and despair. The fence posts sagged, their wood bleached to the color of bone. The barn, once a proud heart pumping life into the property, now slumped like a dying animal, its roof a patchwork of rust and hope long since surrendered. His own legs, two useless anchors of flesh and memory beneath a dusty blanket, were a perfect match for the landscape. They were there, they occupied space, but they served no purpose. The pain was a constant low hum, a phantom limb symphony conducted in a body that had betrayed him. Sometimes it was a sharp, electric shock, a cruel reminder of the IED that had cleaved his life in two. Other times, it was a dull, crushing weight, the sheer gravity of his own uselessness. Hope was a foreign country he'd been deported from years ago. The sound of an engine, sputtering and straining, was an intrusion, a violation of the sacred, suffocating silence he curated. Gideon shielded his eyes, his hand a gnarled piece of leather against the glare. A pickup truck, older than sin and coughing a plume of blue smoke, rattled up the long dirt driveway. It was Boone Carter. Of course it was Boone. His neighbor was a man carved from the same hard earth as the ranch, his face a roadmap of droughts and hard winters, his eyes holding a quiet, knowing sadness that Gideon found both infuriating and, on the rare occasion he was honest with himself, comforting. The truck shuddered to a halt, and Boone climbed out, moving with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who'd learned not to waste a single motion. But he wasn't alone. Trailing behind the truck on a lead rope was a horse. Gideon's first thought was a bitter, internal laugh. A horse. What in God's name was he supposed to do with a horse? He could barely manage his own broken body. The animal was magnificent, even in its ruin. A deep, rich bay, its coat the color of polished mahogany where the sun caught it, but matted and dull with neglect. It was tall, with the elegant, powerful lines of a thoroughbred, a creature built for speed and glory. But it was the way it moved that snagged Gideon's attention, a detail that resonated with the discordant melody of his own existence. The horse favored its left foreleg, a pronounced, sickening limp that made its every step a stuttering apology, broken, just like him. "What the hell is this, Boone?" Gideon's voice was rust, torn from a throat more accustomed to silence and whiskey. Boone didn't answer immediately. He looped the horse's lead rope around a fence post and ambled over, his boots scuffing up little puffs of protest from the dust. He stopped a few feet from the wheelchair, his shadow falling over Gideon's legs. "Name's Thunder." "I don't care if his name is Armageddon," Gideon snapped. "I didn't ask for a horse. I can't take care of a horse." "You're not," Boone said, his voice as dry as the creek bed. "You're taking care of each other." He looked from Gideon's rigid posture in the chair to the horse, who stood with its head low, its great dark eye watching them with an intelligence that felt ancient and weary. "He's a former champion. Shattered his cannon bone in his last race. They were going to put him down. Said he was worthless." The word hung in the air between them. Worthless. It was the brand seared onto Gideon's own soul. He'd been a soldier, a leader of men, a man whose body was a finely tuned instrument of purpose. Now he was a collection of failing parts, a burden on the state, a ghost haunting his own property. He looked at the horse again. He saw the tremor in its powerful shoulder as it shifted its weight, the way it held its magnificent head at an angle of perpetual discomfort. He saw a mirror. "And you thought the perfect place for a worthless, broken-down animal was with a worthless, broken-down man?" The sarcasm was a shield, thick and layered. "Seemed right," Boone said, utterly immune to the venom. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded, oil-stained piece of paper. "This came with him." He handed it to Gideon. It was a single sheet, typed, with handwritten notes in the margins. It was from a trainer, Dr. Samuel Reed. The man who trained him before the injury said the horse understands more than people give him credit for, said he's got a gift for listening. Gideon scoffed, but he didn't give the paper back. His fingers, calloused from gripping the wheels of his chair, traced the faded type. A gift for listening. Great. We can sit here in the dust and listen to each other fall apart. Maybe, Boone said, turning to leave, or maybe you'll listen to each other get put back together. He walked back to his truck without another word, climbed in, and with a final belching complaint from the engine, rattled back down the drive, leaving Gideon alone in the vast, indifferent silence, with the dust, the setting sun, and the crippled champion, who was now impossibly his responsibility. For 3 days, thunder was just another feature of the desolate landscape. Gideon left a bucket of water and a flake of hay near the barn, wheeling himself out in the punishing morning heat and the cool of the evening, performing the chore with a grim, detached resentment. The horse watched him. It was the watching that unsettled him most. It wasn't the placid, dumb gaze of a typical animal. Thunder's eyes, dark and deep as well water, seemed to follow his every move with a kind of unnerving comprehension. They tracked the clumsy, powerful rotation of the wheels, the strain in Gideon's shoulders, the tight set of his jaw. Gideon felt seen, exposed in a way that made the hair on his arms stand up. He shouted at the horse once, a raw, frustrated roar born of a dropped wrench and a phantom pain that lanced through his thigh. "What are you looking at?" The horse didn't flinch. It simply blinked, slow and deliberate, and let out a soft, low nicker that sounded less like an animal noise and more like a sigh of commiseration. The sound echoed in the quiet barn, and for a moment, the crushing weight of Gideon's isolation felt a fraction lighter, as if shared. On the 4th day, driven by a flicker of something he refused to name, curiosity perhaps, or the dregs of a discipline he thought long dead, Gideon wheeled himself into the dusty tack room of the barn and retrieved the trainer's notes. He unfolded the greasy paper under the single fly-specked bulb. "Thunder doesn't respond to commands, he responds to conversation," the type read. "He needs to understand the why. His intelligence is his greatest asset and his greatest burden." In the margin, a handwritten scrawl added, "Talk to him, about anything. He feels the intent behind the words." Gideon let out a short, sharp laugh. "The intent behind the words," he muttered to the empty room. "Right." Still, he wheeled himself out to the front of the barn where Thunder stood, a stoic silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. He cleared his throat, feeling like a damn fool. "So," he began, his voice rough, "your name is Thunder. Stupid name for a cripple." The horse's ear twitched, swiveling toward him. "They say you were a champion. Racked up a couple million in winnings. Bet you loved that. The roar of the crowd, the flash of the cameras, and then crack." He slapped his own thigh, the sound dead and fleshy. "One bad step and it's all gone. They ship you off to die because you can't make them any more money." Sound familiar? He was talking to the horse, but the words were for himself. A litany of his own loss, spoken aloud for the first time. He talked about the suffocating heat of the desert, the bond with his men, the blinding white flash, and the long, slow fall into darkness. He talked about the sterile white hospitals, the pitying looks, the hollow promises of recovery. He talked until his throat was raw, the bitterness pouring out of him like poison drawn from a wound. Through it all, Thunder stood motionless, his head cocked, his dark eyes fixed on Gideon's face. When Gideon finally fell silent, exhausted and empty, the horse took a limping step closer, and then another, until its great head was level with Gideon's. It let out a soft puff of air from its nostrils, a warm breath against his cheek that smelled of hay and dust and a strange, deep calm. Then it nudged his hand, the one clenched white-knuckled on the armrest of his chair. Tentatively, Gideon unclenched his fist and laid it flat on the horse's velvety nose. A tremor went through the animal, and a corresponding, unfamiliar flicker of warmth spread through Gideon's chest. It wasn't a cure, it wasn't a miracle, it was just a connection. A single fragile thread spun in the darkness. The notes became his manual. He mirrors the emotional state of his handler. If you are agitated, he will be agitated. Find your center before you approach him. Gideon started practicing breathing exercises he'd been taught by a VA therapist he'd summarily dismissed as a quack. He'd sit by the barn door, breathing in the scent of dust and hay, breathing out the rage, until the frantic hummingbird of anxiety in his chest slowed to a steady beat. Only then would he approach the horse. They developed a routine. He would groom Thunder, his hands moving over the powerful muscles, feeling the subtle knots of tension, learning the landscape of the horse's body as intimately as he knew his own. He spoke to Thunder constantly, his monologues shifting from bitter recollections to a kind of running commentary on the state of the ranch, the weather, the memories stirred by the scent of rain on dry earth. One afternoon, reading another of Dr. Reed's notes, he found a passage that stopped him cold. His physical recovery is tied to his sense of purpose. He needs a job. Start with simple things. Ask him to stand still. Ask him to be a point of stability. In the margin, Reed had written, "He can be a rock. Let him." A wild, impossible idea took root in Gideon's mind. It was insane. It was stupid. It was dangerous. He wheeled himself next to Thunder, who was dozing in a patch of sun. The horse opened an eye, regarding him placidly. "Okay, you big broken bastard," Gideon whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Here's the deal. You're my rock. That's your new job." He positioned the wheelchair parallel to the horse's massive body. He took a deep breath, trying to find his center. He gripped the thick leather of the saddle he'd draped over Thunder's back, his other hand pressing down on the armrest of his chair. "Stay," he commanded, his voice tight. "Just stay." He pushed. He poured every ounce of strength from his arms, his shoulders, his back, into the effort. His muscles screamed. Sweat beaded on his forehead and trickled into his eyes. For a terrifying second, his legs, those dead weights, threatened to buckle sideways. But Thunder didn't move. He stood as solid as the granite of the mountains on the horizon, a living wall of muscle and bone. Gideon's arms trembled violently, but he was up, his weight precariously balanced between the chair and the horse. He wasn't standing, not really. He was hanging. But his feet were on the ground, and through the soles of his boots, through the layers of numbness and deadened nerves, he felt something. It wasn't pain. It wasn't sensation as he once knew it. It was a ghost, a whisper, a faint, deep vibration traveling up from the earth through his bones, a ghost of a memory of what it felt like to be connected to the ground. A sob caught in his throat. He hung there for a heartbeat, 2, 3, before his strength gave out and he collapsed back into the chair, gasping, his body shaking with exertion and a terrifying, fragile flicker of hope. He looked up at Thunder. The horse let out another soft nicker and nudged his shoulder, as if to say, "See? We did it." This became their sacred ritual. Every day they practiced. Gideon's arms grew stronger, his core tightened. The duration he could support himself stretched from seconds to almost a minute. The ghost of sensation in his legs became a more frequent visitor, a low thrum of static that felt more like life than anything he'd felt in years. He began to see the ranch not as a graveyard, but as a project. He fixed a section of fence. He patched a leak in the water trough. He was still in the chair, but he was no longer confined by it. He was moving, working, building. The Hope, once a terrifying stranger, was becoming a quiet companion. It was this fragile new world that Marcus Webb came to shatter. Webb arrived in a cloud of dust far more arrogant than Boone's, kicked up by the tires of a gleaming black pickup truck that looked like it had never seen a dirt road. 2 men, burly and silent, sat in the cab with him. Webb himself was soft in the way that hard men who use money instead of fists become soft. His face was fleshy, his eyes small and predatory, his smile a thin, bloodless slash. He was a local businessman, a developer who bought up distressed properties from struggling ranchers and turned them into soulless vacation homes for city folk. He saw land not as a legacy, but as a line item on a balance sheet. He strode toward Gideon, his polished boots looking obscene on the dusty ground. He didn't offer a hand, just a dismissive glance at the wheelchair before his eyes settled on Thunder, who was standing near the barn. A flicker of something, recognition, greed, passed through his eyes. "Flint," Webb said, his voice smooth and condescending. "Heard you were back from playing hero. Tough break." He gestured vaguely at Gideon's legs. Gideon's hands tightened on his wheels. "What do you want, Webb?" "Your property," Webb said, getting straight to the point. "It's an eyesore, delinquent on taxes, falling apart. I'm prepared to make you a fair offer, take the burden off your hands, give you enough to find a nice little apartment in the city, someplace accessible." The sneer was barely veiled. "The ranch isn't for sale." Webb laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Don't be sentimental. It's a dead end, just like you. I'm offering you a way out." His eyes drifted back to Thunder. "I'll even take the horse off your hands. Looks like he's seen better days. I've got a man who could use him for dog food." A white-hot rage, cold and pure, surged through Gideon. It was different from the helpless anger he'd felt for years. This was protective. This was focused. It was the rage of a man with something to lose. Before he could stop himself, he was speaking. "You and your men get the hell off my property. Now." Webb's smile vanished. "Listen to me, cripple. I've already bought up your debt from the county. You've got 30 days to pay the back taxes in full or the property goes to auction. And I'll be the only bidder. So you can take my offer now, walk away with something in your pocket, or you can be stubborn and walk away with nothing." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Either way, I'm getting this land. And for your attitude, I'm going to make sure that horse is the first thing to go." He turned and walked away, his two goons trailing him like vultures. The black truck roared to life and sped off, leaving Gideon in a suffocating silence, the dust of its departure tasting like ash in his mouth. The 30-day ultimatum was a death sentence. The fragile world he and Thunder had started to build was about to be bulldozed. He looked over at the horse, who was watching him, his great head high, his ears pricked, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, the poison that had just been spilled on their sanctuary. The hope that had been a flickering candle was now threatened by a hurricane. But as Gideon looked into those deep, intelligent eyes, he felt something else alongside the fear. He felt defiance. Webb had made a critical mistake. He hadn't just threatened Gideon's home, he had threatened his horse. He had threatened the only other soul who understood what it meant to be broken and deemed worthless. And in that moment, Gideon Flint, the man who had given up, decided to fight back. He was no longer just a broken man on a broken ranch. He was a veteran, and he had just been handed a war. The ultimatum settled over the ranch like a shroud, but beneath it, something new and hard was taking shape in Gideon. The apathy that had been his constant companion for years was burned away by the clean fire of rage. He was a soldier again, and Webb had just defined the battlefield, the objective, and the stakes. His objective wasn't just to save the ranch anymore, it was to protect Thunder. The quiet defiance he'd felt was crystallizing into a plan, a desperate long-shot strategy, but a strategy nonetheless. He spent the next day on the phone, his voice clipped and efficient, a tone he hadn't used since he commanded his unit. He called the county tax office, confirming the exact amount, the terrifying number that might as well have been $1 million. He called the VA, navigating the bureaucratic labyrinth, trying to find out if there were any emergency grants, any loopholes, any help at all. He was met with polite but firm negatives, a chorus of bureaucratic regret. The walls were closing in. As dusk fell, he sat in his chair, the weight of impending failure pressing down on him. He felt the old hopelessness creeping back in, a cold tide licking at the edges of his resolve. Thunder, as if sensing the shift, limped over from the trough and rested his head on Gideon's shoulder. The simple, heavy warmth was an anchor. Gideon closed his eyes, his hand stroking the horse's powerful neck. "It's not enough, boy," he murmured. "I'm not enough." The horse snorted, then lifted his head and nudged Gideon's chest, hard. Then he did it again, a surprisingly insistent shove. He turned his great head toward the dark maw of the barn, then looked back at Gideon, his eyes seeming to command him. "What?" Gideon asked, perplexed. "What's in the barn?" Thunder nudged him again, more forcefully this time, and took a limping step toward the barn's entrance, then stopped, waiting. It was uncanny. It felt less like an animal's random gesture and more like a deliberate, urgent communication. A sliver of the trainer's notes flashed in his mind. He understands more than people give him credit for. A strange feeling, a mix of disbelief and desperate curiosity, propelled Gideon forward. He wheeled himself into the barn, the air thick with the smell of old hay, leather, and thyme. The single bulb cast long, dancing shadows. Thunder followed close behind, his limp a soft, rhythmic thud on the packed earth floor. The horse bypassed his own stall and moved toward the back of the barn, to a corner piled high with junk. Rotted scraps of lumber, old tires, rusted pieces of forgotten machinery. It was the corner where his father had tossed anything he didn't have the time or the heart to deal with. Thunder stopped in front of a large, dust-caked wooden crate and nudged it with his nose. "This," Gideon wheeled closer, skepticism warring with the horse's strange insistence. "It's just junk, Thunder. Old memories." The horse nudged the crate again, then struck the lid with his hoof, not hard, but with a sharp, definitive rap. The sound echoed in the cavernous space. Gideon stared from the horse to the crate. This was beyond coincidence. It was a message. With a grunt of effort, he leaned from his chair and pried at the lid with a nearby crowbar. The wood was old and soft, and with a groan of protest, the nails gave way. He heaved the lid off. The smell of cedar and mothballs filled the air. Inside, nestled in yellowed newspaper, was not junk. It was a time capsule. His breath caught in his throat. He saw the flash of vibrant color first. He reached in and pulled out a set of racing silks, the fabric still shockingly bright. A field of royal blue with a brilliant golden lightning bolt streaking across it. Beneath them, he found a collection of silver trophies, tarnished but heavy, their engravings proclaiming victory after victory at tracks whose names were legendary: Santa Anita, Belmont, Churchill Downs. And beneath the trophies, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick leather portfolio. His fingers trembled as he unfastened the clasp. Inside were official documents, crisp and perfectly preserved. A certificate of pedigree tracing a bloodline back to man-o'-war, a bill of sale, and a sheaf of papers that made his blood run cold and hot at the same time. Stud contracts. Agreements detailing the rights to the horse's legendary bloodline, rights that, even with his injury, were worth a fortune. He frantically scanned the bill of sale, his eyes searching for the owner's name. It wasn't a name he recognized. It was a corporation, Westwood Equine Group. But stapled to it was a transfer of ownership document, dated just over a year ago. The name of the new owner was Marcus Webb. It hit Gideon like a physical blow. Webb hadn't just happened upon the horse. He knew exactly what Thunder was. He hadn't seen a broken-down animal. He'd seen a stolen asset, a champion hidden in plain sight. Webb's plan wasn't just to steal Gideon's land. It was to reclaim his hidden treasure, a horse he'd likely acquired through fraudulent means and then lost track of after the injury. The dog food comment wasn't just cruelty. It was a threat designed to make Gideon see the horse as worthless, to make him give up without a fight. Gideon looked from the papers in his hand to the magnificent animal standing patiently beside him. He saw it all now, the champion's spirit, the intuitive intelligence that had led him here, to this very crate. Thunder hadn't just been discarded, he'd been stolen, hidden, and left for dead. And somehow, Through a twist of fate orchestrated by a kind-hearted neighbor, he had ended up with the one man who was now in Webb's crosshairs. "He knew," Gideon whispered, the words filled with a terrible clarity. "That son of a bitch knew who you were all along." He looked down at his own useless legs, then at the proud, scarred head of the horse beside him. The feeling of being a victim, a passive recipient of fate's cruelties, evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of a man defending his own. This was no longer just his fight. It was Thunder's fight. He was no longer just defending a piece of dirt. He was defending a legacy. A righteous fury, sharper and more potent than any emotion he'd felt since the war, settled deep in his bones. He looked at the documents, at the proof of Thunder's stolen glory, and he knew with absolute conviction that he would not let Webb win. He would not let him erase this horse, this magnificent soul who had, against all odds, shown him the way back to life. He wheeled himself and Thunder out of the barn, into the clean, cool air of the evening. The sky was a tapestry of deep purple and fading orange. He positioned himself beside the horse, his jaw set. There was no hesitation this time, no flicker of doubt. He grabbed the saddle, placed his other hand on the armrest of his chair, and looked into Thunder's eye. "All right, partner," he said, his voice low and steady. "Let's practice. We've got a war to win." He pushed himself up, his muscles firing with a newfound purpose. He was not just a man trying to stand. He was a warrior preparing for battle, supported by his most trusted ally. They were a unified team, two broken fighters, ready to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. The world had tried to break them both and cast them aside. Now, together, they were going to prove just how wrong the world had been. The days that followed took on a new rhythm, a cadence of desperate preparation. The 30-day clock was a merciless metronome in the back of Gideon's mind. He secured the precious documents from the barn in a fireproof box, a tangible symbol of their shared fight. Each morning began not with despair, but with their ritual, man and horse, side by side, practicing the act of standing. It was no longer just physical therapy, it was a drill, a hardening, a forging of a weapon. The connection between them deepened, becoming something telepathic. Gideon no longer needed to voice the command to stay. Thunder seemed to feel his intent, planting his feet, his body becoming an immovable bastion of support the moment Gideon's hands took their grip. The ghost of sensation in Gideon's legs became a more insistent presence, a low-voltage current that spoke of sleeping nerves beginning to stir. He was holding his own weight for longer, transitioning more smoothly, the shame of his dependency being replaced by the pride of their partnership. He spent his afternoons on the phone again, but this time his calls were different. He wasn't begging for help. He was gathering intelligence. He spoke to a legal aid lawyer for veterans, a young, earnest woman who listened patiently to his story about the land and the tax debt. When he mentioned Marcus Webb, there was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Flint," she said carefully, "you're not the first veteran to call me about him. He has a pattern of acquiring debt and forcing foreclosures, but it's all technically legal, predatory, but legal." The news was a blow, but not a knockout. He knew Webb's vulnerability wasn't the land, it was the horse. He researched Westwood Equine Group, the name on the original bill of sale. It was a defunct company, dissolved years ago amidst rumors of bankruptcy and fraud. The pieces were slotting together, forming a picture of a complex, long-running scam. Webb was a scavenger, picking over the bones of other people's failures and crimes. Gideon felt like he was standing at the edge of a vast, dark conspiracy, with only a crippled horse and a set of old papers as his weapons. The pressure mounted. One afternoon, one of Webb's trucks drove slowly past the ranch entrance, not stopping, just a silent, ominous reminder of the looming deadline. Gideon saw the driver's face, a hard, blank stare meant to intimidate. He felt a tremor of fear, but when he looked over at Thunder, the horse was watching the truck with a calm, regal disdain that seemed to flow directly into Gideon, shoring up his own resolve. "We will not be moved," that steady gaze seemed to say. The breakthrough came on a sun-drenched afternoon, 2 weeks before the deadline. The air was still and hot, the sky a vast, empty blue. They were in their usual spot by the barn. Gideon had been feeling a strange energy all day, a humming in his blood. He gripped the saddle. He pushed. But this time, something was different. As his weight transferred from the chair, he did something he hadn't done before. He consciously tried to engage the muscles in his legs, to will them into service. He focused on the memory of standing, on the feeling of the earth solid beneath his feet. And then it happened. He felt it. A definite, undeniable contraction in his right quadriceps. A shuddering, spasmodic clenching of muscle that was entirely his own. It wasn't just a ghost of a feeling. It was a signal, a live wire. For a split second, his leg bore a fraction of his weight. It was enough. With that tiny, miraculous bit of help from his own body, he was able to shift his balance, to straighten his back, to lock his arms. He was standing, not hanging, not leaning, but standing. His arms were still trembling with the effort, his knuckles white, but his weight was distributed, supported by the horse on one side, and by the flickering, nascent life in his own limbs on the other. He lifted his head, a wild, incredulous laugh bubbling up from his chest. The world looked different from this height, taller, wider, more full of possibility. He looked at the horizon, at the distant mountains that had for so long seemed like the impassable walls of his prison. Now they looked like a destination. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight, and in that moment, they were not symbols of decay, but tiny, glittering particles of magic. He looked at Thunder, whose deep, dark eye was level with his, reflecting his own stunned joy. A profound, silent understanding passed between them. This was it. This was the victory. Whatever happened with Webb, whatever happened with the ranch, they had achieved this. They had taken two broken things and made one whole, standing being. It was in that perfect, suspended moment of triumph that the sound of an engine intruded once again. Not the arrogant roar of Webb's truck, but the familiar, sputtering rattle of Boone Carter's old pickup. Gideon's heart sank. He didn't want anyone to see this, to break the spell. He didn't want the pity or the surprise. He just wanted to exist in this one perfect moment with his horse. But the truck wasn't slowing down. It pulled up the drive and came to a stop, and as the dust settled, Gideon saw that Boone was not alone. 3 other people climbed out of the truck. The first was an older gentleman with a kind, intelligent face, and a look of stunned wonder as he stared at Gideon and Thunder. The second was a woman with a stern, authoritative air, her eyes sharp and assessing. The third was a man in a crisp suit, carrying a briefcase, looking entirely out of place on the dusty ranch, but scanning his surroundings with a keen, purposeful gaze. Gideon's first instinct was to collapse back into his chair, to hide his miraculous, fragile achievement. But Thunder stood firm, a living buttress, and Gideon found he could not bring himself to surrender the height he had fought so hard to win. He remained standing, defiant and exposed as the 4 figures approached. Boone Carter's weathered face was split by a rare, wide grin. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes moving from the standing man to the steadfast horse. "Knew you two would figure it out," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The kind-faced gentleman stepped forward, his eyes shining. "Gideon Flint?" he asked, his voice gentle. "My name is Dr. Samuel Reed." Gideon's mind reeled. Dr. Reed, the trainer, the man who wrote the notes, the man who understood Thunder's soul. "You—" Gideon started, his own voice cracking. "I've been looking for this horse for over a year," Dr. Reed said, his gaze fixed on Thunder with a deep, paternal affection. "He disappeared from the recovery facility, stolen in the middle of the night. We thought he was gone forever." The woman with the authoritative air stepped forward next. "Mr. Flint, I am Judge Harrison, from the State Circuit Court. We've been investigating a rather complex case of equine fraud for some time now, with Mr. Webb as our primary person of interest. Your neighbor, Mr. Carter, contacted us after a rather illuminating conversation with you about your tax situation and a certain horse. Finally, the man in the suit spoke, opening his briefcase. And I am Daniel Morrison from the Veterans Rehabilitation Foundation. And this, Mr. Flint, is where the story gets truly interesting. He pulled out a file, thick with paperwork. 2 years ago, a philanthropic donor established a fund with us. The goal was to pair disabled veterans with companion and therapy animals that had also been discarded. The donor specified that the animals should be former champions, believing that 2 broken warriors could heal each other. He paused, letting the words sink in. The very first animal acquired for this program was a racehorse named Thunder, purchased legally from the bankrupt Westwood Equine Group. And the very first veteran selected, based on his file, his service record, and his isolated circumstances, was you. The world tilted on its axis. Gideon stared at him, uncomprehending. Me? But I never applied. You didn't have to, Morrison said. You were chosen. All the paperwork was finalized. Legally, this horse, he gestured to Thunder, who let out a low, rumbling sigh, as if he'd been waiting for this very moment, has been your property for nearly 18 months. He was stolen from Dr. Reed's facility just days before he was scheduled to be transported to you. Gideon felt the strength in his arms waver, the world blurring at the edges. The cascade of revelations was too much. The theft, the program, the fact that Thunder was meant to be his all along. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't Boone's random act of kindness. It was destiny. A destiny that had been stolen, diverted, and had now, impossibly, found its way home. Webb, Gideon breathed, the name tasting like poison. Marcus Webb, Judge Harrison said, her voice like chipping ice, was a junior partner at Westwood Equine. We believe he's been using his inside knowledge to illegally acquire and sell off the company's lost assets. When he found out where Thunder was, he couldn't just reclaim him without exposing his own fraud. So, he planned to do what he does best: intimidate you, steal your land, and reacquire the horse under the guise of a foreclosure. He never counted on you fighting back. He never counted on you discovering the horse's true identity. Gideon's gaze shifted from the determined faces of the officials to Boone, whose quiet act of neighborly concern had been the catalyst for everything. Then he looked at Thunder. He saw not a burden, not a cripple, not a coincidence, but his partner, his salvation, the faded other half of his own broken soul. The rage against Webb was still there, but it was now dwarfed by a profound, overwhelming sense of awe. The universe hadn't abandoned him in this dusty wasteland. It had sent him a map, a key, a reason. It had sent him Thunder. Leaning on the unshakable strength of his horse, Gideon Flint stood tall under the vast sky, the truth of his situation settling over him not as a weight, but as a grace. His fight was over, and his real purpose was just beginning. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Armed with the documents from Gideon's barn and the testimony of Dr. Reed, Judge Harrison's investigation closed in on Marcus Webb like a steel trap. The threat of foreclosure evaporated, replaced by warrants and subpoenas. Webb's empire, built on the intimidation of the vulnerable, crumbled under the weight of his own greed. He had underestimated the resolve of a broken soldier and the soul of a champion horse. The news of his arrest was a distant rumble of thunder that barely registered on Gideon's new horizon. The external threat was neutralized, but the internal transformation was the true victory. Daniel Morrison and Dr. Reed stayed for hours, sitting on the porch Gideon had so long considered the edge of his world. They laid out the full scope of the Veterans Rehabilitation Foundation's vision. They had the funding, they had the candidates, veterans adrift in the same sea of hopelessness from which Gideon had just been rescued. But they lacked a heart, a center, a place where the healing could happen. The donor's vision was never just about one man and one horse, Morrison explained, his gaze sweeping across the sprawling, neglected ranch. It was about creating a sanctuary, a place where the principles of what you two have accomplished, he nodded toward Thunder, who was grazing nearby, could be replicated, a place run by someone who understands the journey from the inside out. The offer hung in the air, as vast and potent as the land itself. They weren't just validating his bond with Thunder, they were offering him a calling. To transform the ranch, his family's legacy, from a place of isolation into a haven. To take the dust and the rust and the painful memories and build something new upon them. To turn his greatest wound into his greatest purpose. Gideon looked at his hands, calloused now from work, and not just from his wheelchair. He looked at the barn, which no longer seemed like a tomb, but like a vessel waiting to be filled. He looked at Thunder, his partner in resurrection. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an acceptance. A quiet, solemn yes that resonated with the weight of destiny fulfilled. 6 months later, the ranch was unrecognizable. It was alive. The sagging fences were straight and strong. The barn roof was whole, its fresh red paint a beacon of vitality against the blue sky. New, smaller corrals dotted the landscape, and a wheelchair-accessible ramp now led to the porch of the main house. The dust was still there, but it no longer felt like a shroud. It felt like the honest dirt of a place where good, hard work was being done. The silence was gone, replaced by the murmur of conversation, the soft nickering of horses, and the occasional burst of laughter, a sound Gideon hadn't realized he'd missed so desperately. The sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows, as Gideon stood by the main corral. He was not in his chair. He walked with the aid of a single, sturdy cane in one hand, his other resting gently on Thunder's back. The horse moved with him in perfect sync, his own pronounced limp a rhythmic, steady counterpoint to Gideon's gait. They were two halves of a whole, their shared imperfections creating a unique and graceful form of motion. Gideon's legs were not healed, not in the way the world defined it. The nerves were still damaged, the muscles weak. But they were his. They worked. They carried him forward. He and Thunder stood watching a new arrival, a young woman, a Marine, barely out of her 20s, with eyes that held the same haunted, faraway look Gideon knew so well. She stood stiffly, her arms crossed, as Boone Carter, now a permanent fixture and foreman of the sanctuary, led a gentle-eyed, three-legged mare toward her. The woman looked at the horse's injury with a flicker of contempt, a reflection of her own self-loathing. Gideon knew that look. He had lived behind those eyes. He pushed himself off from Thunder's supportive flank and began to walk toward her, his steps slow but deliberate. Thunder walked beside him, their progress a testament to the improbable. The young woman watched him approach, her gaze moving from his face to his cane to the limping horse at his side. He saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the dawning understanding that he was not some whole, perfect man preaching from a place of unblemished strength. He stopped a few feet away, offering a small, quiet smile that was no longer a stranger to his face. "He looks broken, doesn't he?" Gideon said, his voice calm and clear, nodding toward his own magnificent scarred horse. "I thought so too at first." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting her truly see him, see the horse, see the possibility. "We're not here to be fixed," Gideon continued, his gaze meeting hers, a direct line of shared experience. "We're here to find a reason to move forward, and sometimes, the only one who can show you the way is someone who knows the path, every splinter and every scar. Healing isn't about becoming what you were before, it's about becoming what you are now, together." He reached out and laid his hand on Thunder's neck. The horse sighed, a deep, contented sound, and leaned into his touch. Man and horse, veterans of different wars, standing side by side, their brokenness not a liability, but the very source of their power to heal. Gideon was no longer a ghost haunting his own life. He was a guide, a guardian of this hard-earned peace, the keeper of a sanctuary built on the profound and simple truth that the deepest wounds, when shared, can become the foundations of our greatest strength. He had found his home, not in a place, but in a purpose he walked toward one difficult, beautiful, and supported step at a time.